let's see. First of all, I'll tell you what I've done so far in the last time since we last met. Then and then you can ask me questions as I'm going through that.
Okay.
And then after that, we'll go into. I want to focus on two things where I'll ask you to kind of focus, on off the top of your head, or think about some of these ideas and give me some ideas on it. So first of all, what I've done is I viewed 11 films.
Did you find the right one yet?
No, it's not there. I guarantee it. I looked under every possible category, and there isn't anything produced by Sky River Productions. And what was the format of that? It was someone was interviewing a family about the effects on their children, the boarding school, something on their children. Geez, there's nothing like that. Most of what I found in the 11 films was real valuable, though I wouldn't have spent the time going through many of them. I just sat and enjoyed them. Mostly it was about the natives' attitudes and towards.
You don't recall any of the specific films? You have the titles with you?
I do have the titles with me. You want to see, but
I was just curious. Now I'm really.
It's not in the state library, though. I really went through the whole fiche from A to Z, every possible category I was thinking. One was called Eskimo Family, a short one, and that was good. Eskimos, cultural assimilation, changing world of the Eskimos, Village of No River, that was kind of interesting. And Yesterday, Today.
Village of No River was good, wasn't it? From Juneau.
Yeah.
That's my first teaching assignment. That was a good film. Good film. That's the place I told you ought to go do your student intern.
Yeah, I thought
your student teaching.
That was a real interesting film.
Yeah.
Really impressed. They feel
who produced that one, remember?
No.
That was a good movie, a good film. I saw that, gosh, it's quite a few years ago now. I was impressed with it.
It really, that one really makes you think, really gets into the heart of the issue. At the end of it, there's the very old village man who's talking in his own language, and they have the subtitles, that's how they ended it. And he said, some of the last words or something like, and the children, they're changing, they're different now. And that relates to one part that I saw in another film where this village woman was pointing at like some little carving, and saying that the children long ago used to make these carvings, and she's going, when they used to make these carvings, they knew who they were. This was their center of their activities and their development. They could produce fine quality, and they knew. Now they're confused. They're this way and they're that way. They're producing nothing. Real. So that was kind of a neat feeling for us. The native woman kind of relates to that. They're off center. They don't know who they are. And some other quotes from those films were like, "We must remember where the old people are buried. We must not forget where they are buried. We must not forget that their way of life." Things I've known, but it was real nice to just go over hours and hours, over a few day period to continually reinforce in me. So that was good and valuable. Have any questions about those?
No, you picked a beauty. I can't speak the others, but from what you indicated, the one about the big chocolate about the big carving. It's good. Real good. But I think one with Illinois, Village of No River.
This other one, Yesterday, Today, was a real interesting format.
Yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead with the.
the one yesterday in Terrebonne says all it was the people said we're gonna at the start it said we've gone into this village home and we're going to do nothing but shoot their film and try not to disrupt their daily activities, and this will be at their activities from day until night, and we'll edit it, you know. So they filmed this family and their activities nowadays and their daily activities. But at certain points they would cut back to this black and white shot of a village family before, 40 years ago or something. And it was really kind of moving. No words were said except for what the family would exchange, and things. But that was being very rare. The feeding the children, the man was doing a lot of carving. It was just to see that. And then when they would shift back to see how things had changed, but how people really don't change. We can try to change their external things, but there's values there which makes people who they are. That like the cutbacks were like the same kind of way they fed their child today was the same way they fed their child 40 years ago, or the same way they had to get warm today. They had to get warm before, and there was then in the modern day there's a few more extra accoutrements and a little more confusion. It's kind of interesting ideas people have had to approach that. The other thing I've been looking at is North to the Future more. I'm really going through this slowly because there's so much in it. And what this basically is so far looking is how the powers and influence have developed from the government standpoint. And that's been an interesting polarity for me to do that. And,
I see down that's one the Bill Marsh is.
Yeah.
I think it's 67. Bill Marsh. Pretty good publication.
Yeah, it's got a lot in it.
I haven't looked at it for a few years, but there's a lot of work on it.
And so this talks about the what I've read so far, the development of the AEA, the Alaska Education Association, what their initial reasons for getting together was, the Superintendent's Advisory Commission, and talks about briefly about some of the first legislation that was done, how that was done, how things were sort of consolidated under legislation. It's kind of interesting. I'm having a good time with that. And writing a lot down. I wrote down the articles, and, in my own handwriting, so that could really reinforce in me of what the powers of the Commissioner of Education were, how his job originally unfolded, the articles that defined his job, and that was pretty interesting. How it said he's responsible for formulating educational policies, yet he has to, the board has to approve what he does, and then they'll initiate him to go ahead and do it. That's pretty much how it was for you. Same kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay, but that leads into two things I want to talk about. One is that I'm starting to focus on how I'm going to write up a paper on some of the things we've explored. And so I'm going to have to start making some steps, defining some parameters for a paper. And also what I want to talk about is...
Are you going to use a paper in class? Or is it just for your own personal?
What I think well, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. Okay, we might as well go right into that. What would your aim be? And it should be something that you would like me to do to focus on some certain things to write up in a paper for you to utilize in some future teaching that you might do with in a class, or something you in order to start some of your own paper off of that, or should I just do a paper where I'll just deliver it like I did my treatise earlier, where I'll write it up and I'll pick up some time and I'll deliver it before the students and faculty body again. Do that before the semester's out.
Why don't you write it up? Maybe the best way is to assume you were going to put it in a publication or something that you were submitted to the Method magazine, if that gets going again, that they have here in the school. Maybe you will put it in some other publication that the Department of Education has, the Alaskan Education News, which is a monthly newspaper that goes out to a lot of people. Which, by the way, there was something I should try to get a copy of that for you. You're down at the department, you can pick up the last issue. There's a little section in there on BIA coming to a close. Capture the history of the BIA activity in the state. So the last schools are transferring over this year. So there won't be any more BIA schools. There's more BIA day schools. Last after this school. I'm trying to think of an appropriate source. I could use it no matter which way you went. In other words, if you decide you want to make a presentation first forum situation. Your other work, I can still use the information for future purposes. If you write it as an article, I can use it. From my standpoint, I can use it no matter which way you write it out. I'm trying to think of where it might be the most satisfying. But the most satisfying application might be for you. As you know, the presentation to students in faculty is a little discouraging because of the numbers. It's a lot of work for a very small number of people. So I would think that it might have greater exposure if it were written with the notion of publication of some kind. Now, I don't know what we've come up with as a result of our fun talking. You've come up with a real good appreciation for a lot of rural education with all the research you've done. I don't know how helpful I've been other than to say, hey, maybe you ought to go look at this. I've given you a bump and steer on a film, which I'm going to have to track down now since you were unsuccessful at following the major clues I gave you. Sky River Film, go get it.
Well, the value is simply that it's hard for you to see the value because
I kind of lived it, you close to it.
You've lived it, and so for me, it's like I'm understanding certain connections, how this influence, net influence, work, and absorbing it, researching it. So it has been valuable just to have someone to have some live feedback and some direction. But that,
excuse me, just
sure.
I have to call a guy.
Okay.
Why don't you turn that off?
Sure.
Let me call it back and then they'll call me. I'll find out.
I wonder who has it. Okay. So, but I think I want to give you some ideas on now how what I feel we have come up with and some real direction of how we're going to anchor it into a paper. I was listening to the first interview that I did with Bill Demert a year ago, and again, one line that he said really struck out to me, and it struck with a note with me. He said, ultimately, the success of all those children out there depends on that teacher, on the person's teacher. No matter what else is happening, ultimately it depends on the teacher relationship and the cultivation of that relationship. And so what I want to focus on in the paper, of course we're calling it the establishment of the patterns of education in Alaska. What I'm thinking of doing is starting it out by defining what that means, patterns of education, just make some definitions about that, and how there's different kinds of patterns happening, different kinds of patterns from a legislative point of view, depending on whose point of view you're coming from. Whether you're coming from a city point of view, a village point of view, from a legislative point of view, from a native point of view, different patterns have been established. And then, but to focus it on that ultimately there's a teacher-student relationship. A student is learning from someone who knows, right? And what kind of forces work to cultivate that? What patterns have been developed to cultivate that? But what patterns have been developed which oppress that?
Back up again now.
Okay. So ultimately, education is the transfer of knowledge from one person to another, in a major sense, at least in a school setting. There's transfer of knowledge from one person to another. And so we've established an educational system in Alaska, a system that is supposed to help in that transfer. Now, what kinds of patterns have really been developed to cultivate that transfer, that relationship between the teacher and the student, to help, cultivate it, bring in the cultivation of knowledge, and what kinds of things have really oppressed that by kinds of demands that are wholly unrealistic to the people. Does that sound like a good focus? What ideas do you have on that?
I'm thinking about maybe a couple things now.
Okay.
So in essence, you're really talking about an enhancement of the knowledge transmission process. The purpose of education is transmission of knowledge between the teacher and the student, right?
Okay. Yeah. Nothing ultimately education.
Yeah.
There's no other way of learning, but that's one way.
That's one way of looking. You're wondering what the system has done to make that process of the transfer of knowledge better, or make it work. The other part of your question is, what has the system done that has been detrimental to that process? Is that right?
Absolutely,
Do I understand that? Well, you took the last one first, the detrimental part. And you thought in terms of what a lot of the literature said about problems of education, the shortcomings of the educational system in the state, and looked at those, first of all. Maybe as we talk about some of those, we will get a new appreciation for those things which include enhancement. For example, all of the literature says, or most of it will indicate, that the kinds of material, kinds of content contained in the curriculum, or the curricula for all of the schools, frequently was irrelevant. In other words, a section of math may contain problems that involve situations that were totally unrelated to anything the kids do from personal experience. So the relevancy of certain content area did not help in some cases for this knowledge transmission. As an example, I guess this is a kind of thing. The second one was the lack of opportunity to utilize the primary language as a means for expression, thinking, the language of instruction for many years was not the student's primary language. That certainly was different. Third, the primary individuals in the transmission process, at least from a formal sense, the teachers, if you will, were in a sense foreign to the communities. They were outsiders, did not have long time standing in the community, limited appreciation of local culture, values, family structures, and so forth. So the ability to communicate, the ability to understand, the ability to relate was probably not as good as it wasn't as good as it could have been had the teachers been from the same ethnic group, the same community, the same region, where there's a greater understanding of all these different religions. And then there's a whole list of other kinds of things, but I think it has to, the main ones would focus around personnel, the curriculum, the relevancy, the curriculum, the language utilized, and language, curriculum, personnel, there's another aspect. Okay, those things all seem to have some detrimental aspects, right?
When you say curriculum, too, do you mean the fact that, like, one of the things that I'm thinking of is the fact that from the central office, they've made these blanket rules for the state where are applicable to maybe Juneau, but not to
Yeah, okay.
Is that where you're saying that it's, the curriculum is relevant to maybe some people in Juneau, but it's not relevant to all out in the bush? Or is that?
Okay, we have to kind of go back and forth, I guess, in the chronology, because we're covering a lot of our discussion has gone back a number of years, and we brought it up to date. I think that for many years, the curriculum guides, in fact, I know this for a fact in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the guidebooks that you follow, the teacher's guidebook, the goals and objectives for each Bureau of Indian Affairs school were to apply to all schools in the state. They were done in Juneau. They were good for perhaps one location or maybe more than that. But there was an expectation that all Bureau teachers would follow those goals and objectives and apply those in every village from southeastern to northwestern Alaska. Well, you know that that's not going to fit. But that's what was in place for many years. And the state did the same thing with the state operators. It wasn't unique just to the federal government, but the federal government had such an impact for years on the numbers of schools that it was that kind of thing that some teachers followed diligently, and they made those objectives may or may not have fit for those kids. Other teachers ignored the goals and objectives of the centralized approach, or in this master document, probably didn't use anything. So, not only the content, but the application is sometimes, thank you. It's sometimes a problem. In other words, the example I gave you of the math problems, where the math word problems, thought problems, critical thinking problems, they contain items that they had no understanding or appreciation. So there's several ways of looking at that curriculum. You notice that, I'm sure, in your writing, haven't literature or the reading rather that you've done.
Absolutely.
You know, they're always talking about irrelevance and inadequate curriculum. And it's found here today. The survey of the small high school recently completed by points out that there needs to be more work done on curriculum materials for high school class and small high school. Well, that's right. Okay, the things that have enhanced the transmission is, you know, as we look, you can take each one of those things, which at one point in time was a negative, to see what's been done about the whole business of bilingual, the introduction of bilingual programs, back at instruction in a number of schools where UPIC language is the primary language. The first 3 years of education are conducted in UPIC. More UPIC speaking teachers. So, you know, various steps have been taken to overcome the detrimental portions of it to make it more positive. And the same as with the examination of the curriculum. And reading by others. So, back to the original point, is you say, okay, what are some of the areas that might be to enhance the transmission of knowledge, which ones might inhibit?
I think initially, you know, transfer was happening just by the format of their culture.
Yeah.
And we talked about that, some of the different ways that you were saying, teaching them how to fish, teaching them how to dance, all those insignificant others, as you call them. And that was a certain transfer that was happening there. But somehow someone said, you know, there's value in you learning Western cultural ideas and all this knowledge that has been developed for thousands of years in Western civilization. And that, of course, there's a lot of truth to that. And, but, you know, how to balance that, the balance wasn't right. You know, suddenly we enforced that, no, this is the knowledge that we have. Not just that this is another way we can enhance your life. We said, no, this is your knowledge. And here it is. And here's all the laws, the system for your children, how they're going to spend 8 hours of their day learning this stuff. You see? And so instead of saying that we're going to bring this in to help you cultivate your life, to help transfer some, you know, cultivate your life, cultivate your knowledge by this hope, that your knowledge isn't knowledge, this is knowledge, you know. That seems like, from the native point of view, that's what's happening. From what I've read, some maybe people in Juneau were making all this legislation for all these people somewhere else. They don't even know what it's like to travel out of this. So what cultivated it was maybe positive ways that there was the integration. Can you think of ways that there was this positive ways that Western knowledge was transferred to people?
Through the formal education.
Through the formal education. You know, what positive things did happen.
Well, as a result of the establishment of the schools, both federal and state government, the inclusion of materials that came along, eventually the audio-visual parts. I can remember in the early 60s how much students enjoyed movies, 16mm instructional films. In fact, if others in the village knew that there was going to be a film shown at the school, then they come up to the school to see if they could ask if they could watch anything. If it had to do with brushing their teeth, you know, they were interested. About mid-60s, in a lot of the villages, this became a commercial enterprise. The people would start renting films from Pictures Incorporated in Anchorage, showing films in their home from money and became a business for somebody in the community. Whoever had a big house would invite people in, they'd rent a film, charge the people $1 or $2, whatever it was, and they'd make money. It became a money-making activity, looking at movies. And if they could get permission to rent a larger facility, they'd have movies on the weekends. And they get all kinds of movies. They'd run them way late at night, and kids would come to school the next morning just be tired and say, what's the matter? I was up watching movies over at so-and-so's place the night before. And that was a forerunner to television. Well, part of that, it has some negative aspects, but it also had some positive aspects because it was exposing kids to another part of society. Granted, a lot of what they saw was not very factual, but it did have an impact on education. And of course, with the inclusion of satellite communication and television, now if you were to travel to another distance, not only would you be surprised at how much live television there is, but in a great many of those, you will find VCRs that are able to record and play films at a more convenient time. And it's amazing. And that has had a real impact on education. Much of it unplanned, but nevertheless, an impact on language, appreciation for geography. And of course, the time that you spend watching the statewide news and the national news and all this is done a lot. Now, those things weren't introduced, but they were probably introduced through the school, like the films, instructional films, and a lot of television. A lot of it. And ultimately, it came about through other forms of commercial. The initial introduction of that type of teaching approach took place in the school. And the school the radio for the community that took care of the communications by telegrams, guess where that was located? In the school. Because the school was generally the only place that had consistent electricity, had the shortwave radio. So one of the duties of the teacher, the head teacher in most of the villages for a number of years in the early 60s, late 50s and early 60s, was to serve as a telegram operator. You actually had a schedule on the radio that you were to meet each day, like 4 o'clock or 4:15, to tune in to a certain frequency so that the center for the Alaska communication system, whether it be at Bethel or some of the other locations, if they had traffic for your messages for your village, telegrams or something, not necessarily for you, the teacher, but for anybody in the village, it went to the school. So, one of the great things was for the people locally to tune their frequency to that frequency at that time, and they could listen in to see what telegrams were coming to people in the village. So they were listening. Form of education, right? Certainly not one that was planned, but there were different business items transacted, or deaths in the family, whatever the case may be, and people pick it up on the record. And your job as teacher is to write these things down and get their messages. Remember that well, you have to keep a log of that. You type out these telegrams as you got them and keep them in a book and make sure that the recipient got one, and that's part of education. Now they think about it. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that telegraph duty for a long time. But every day you had a schedule on it. They used to come on, I think, in the morning and in the afternoon. You break up your class, for a little while, go in and listen, see if there's any traffic. Usually the way the guy did it, he'd call on the radio and say, today I'm holding traffic for KWG 29 for Gallon, KWG 27 Good News Bay, KWG 34 Monarch, whatever it was, and then he'd listen. And he'd give your name first, and then he'd go back after he listed all of them and start calling. After he didn't have it, he'd shut it off. He'd go do something else. But that was fun. In transmission of information and part of the education that came about through an agency or an institution outside the formal classroom. How there were so many of those different things that played a part of it. The medical clinics played a big part in the health education. Traveling nurses would come out to the village maybe 3 times during the school year, maybe twice during the school year, depending on their staff. Usually a lot of villages to cover. They come out and spend maybe a whole week, 3 or 4 days, and they would meet with people, and then they would conduct examinations. Check ears, check eyes. Ears was the big thing because there's so much of the draining ear problem, otitis media. And so they were constantly trying to pick up the symptoms, look for those, and then treat accordingly and try to catch it at a very early age before the more severe ear damage. Well, as a result of their frequent visits, they had contact with a lot of people. Now, depending upon how they conveyed their message for health, would be a way that people obtained a big part of their education. Now, this is the student age and adults, a lot of the adults. Pregnant mothers come in, be examined by the nurse. The nurse would talk about nutrition. The nurse would talk about other kinds of things related to pregnancy. And then childbirth. Now you talk about an impact on education. Which one do you think had more? The teacher in there going through an irrelevant textbook on health education, or the periodic visits of the nurse? Mm-hmm. I would opt for the periodic visits of the nurse because it was direct. It was very relevant. When they talk about pregnancy, the people who are pregnant. See, that's an area that nobody's ever written much about. And I think an area that would be a fascinating paper, a book, would be on some of the education of indigenous people in Alaska by other than teachers. In addition to that, there were periodic visits by the police, Statehood, although limited because of travel. Began to accelerate, I think, toward the latter 60s. Limited amount in the mid-60s. Because there wasn't the availability. Like they had one trooper at Apple who wanted to cover that whole area. But they played an important role in safety education, understanding of the legal system, if you will, in the sense that you don't take something from somebody else and use it yourself if that other person told you not to. This was an introduction of some concepts that were foreign from the traditional ways. And they were presented by people who came in with uniforms, who sometimes were very sensitive to the cultural differences, other times may not have been. But a part of the education. There were a variety of visiting people. And then as some of the federally funded programs, the Great Society programs like Vista Workers, and some of the federal education programs began to pick up. Vista, for example, rings a bell with me because they started in about 66, 67. All of these people suddenly descended on the villages. We're out here to do something for you. The villagers said, what the hell is it? The Vista workers said, we don't know, but we're here to do something for you. No shit, they didn't know. They had a limited orientation of people who hadn't been told. All of a sudden, here come all of these early 20s, recent college graduates, and in some cases, in other cases, under 20 years of age, I believe. And they're out there trying to find a role to help people, to work with them. In some cases, they made a positive impact. In others, they probably screwed things up because they didn't really understand what it was that they were supposed to be doing. They had really no purpose. We've got a few former Vista workers here. Wally Olson, be a good person to talk to. He helped train some of the Vista workers. Mel Graham used to be a Vista volunteer in rural Alaska. Pat Fitzgerald was a Vista volunteer in rural Alaska. So there are a few of them around, and they came in the mid to the late 60s. They had an impact on the education, but they weren't a part of the school. Head Start came about. Head Start played a major role.
They were totally different in the state legislation.
Oh yeah, Head Start was totally different. Federally funded. They had most of the communities, they found a facility separate from the school, staffed with local people. That's why it was a really successful program. Still is where it's not anyway. Staff local. Significance of working with kids at an early age. And I think research would show that has had a positive impact. They weren't up at some elaborate fancy stuff. They weren't dealing with teachers who were all from outside that community. They overcame some of the things we've talked about before with the teachers that are born to the community. So, I guess off the top of my head, I'm giving you some examples of other kinds of educational processes that took place. Now, when you begin to put all of those together, helpers, police, other federal agencies, the programs that came about with the Great Society, you package all those together and you say, well, education hasn't worked, or education hasn't done this, or education hasn't done that. I suppose if there has been one failing, then maybe a lot of different pieces were going on in an uncoordinated fashion. Whereas had there been some way of pulling a lot of those things together, maybe the result might have different, more effective. No, I don't know. It's probably impossible. It's always weird to look back and say, well, I got a company that has some kind of coordinated plan. And these different ones. Well, that's how it is. And I'm sure that the same kinds of things were taking place before the early 60s, which is my reference point, but they were on a more limited scale. And I haven't talked about the pluses or the negatives of visiting missionaries and all of that sort of stuff. We've read about that.
Yeah, so it seems like,
kind of fun to reminisce a little bit, Timothy, about the good old days in rural Alaska.
You're really going. But, yeah, it seems like, you're just saying that, there's other kinds of transfer of knowledge happening then between the teacher and the student, and that the teachers almost have been limited by what they've been told to define education as. Maybe if that teacher, as you said, did utilize these other things in a more curricular way almost, put more emphasis on those things rather than on the emphasis maybe that they were told to put on, which weren't having any kind of risk, which were just going water down the drain. how they wear a lot, how well their teacher utilized those influences, how well they
Yeah. Yeah, you know, it's just. Anyway, let's go back to what else, what other kinds of things you're thinking of to sharpen the focus.
Well, the whole thing of the roles of the roles that people play and have an impact on the children, and that could be a whole different way. That the way the children look through it from the children's eyes, and to see who are my guides now, how that has been changed. The children looking up, who are my guides in the pattern of my education, with the elders, and other people are defining who are their guides.
You know, I've never thought about this before, but I'm wondering at what point in this whole process siblings became, for example, the role of a sibling changed substantially to guide formal education. As more and more of these, more and more of the kids went out to Mount Edgecombe or boarding school, or went off to school, returned, had an impact on their you know, was this significant in the lives of a lot of those kids? I'm sure it was. And was it the same then? Did the older sibling have the same kind of impact, and will they have the same kind of impact as a result of their formal education in their own community, as compared to the added significance of secondary education when it's obtained away from home? In other words, did the younger kids look up at their older brothers and sisters because they were gone away from home, they're off in some faraway place, and listen to them with a different level of appreciation, understanding, respect because of that unique characteristic of them being gone, versus the fact that you're now home all the time, and the younger kids don't see it as that big a deal as you want it. I don't know.
That's an interesting thought. Yeah. I don't think many people have thought that.
To me, I think it, based on my own experience, I think in many cases those younger kids looked at their older brothers and sisters as guides, too, especially the brothers.
What changes their desire patterns as they're growing up?
Yeah.
They thought about all these other kinds of things that are out there, and their desires change.
I don't know. Fascinating.
Would one way of approaching this paper be to, we've raised so many questions, areas to investigate that haven't been done yet. We've seen certain kinds of investigation that have been able to discover, and but we've raised many questions about areas of investigation that just haven't been done. Would one way be to just talk about all the questions we have raised and suggest in certain areas why the importance of investigating a certain thing, and suggest a way of starting to investigate them? To talk about to put all these different ideas, for someone to look at a paper and see all these different ideas that we've dealt with might be a valuable paper in itself. we raised this question. We, talk about why we raised certain questions, how we came to certain points where we raised certain questions. But now we can't go further with it because there's no information out there yet. We can do that in a number of.
Might be an interesting way. Yeah. Alaska's unanswered questions in rural Alaska. Unanswered educational questions. It'd be fun to see what you could come up with in the way of posing a number of questions that have emerged from our discussion in your readings. When we were just talking about who really served as a inspiration and as a guide, if you will, to a youngster's formal learning process. It was a role reserved only for the recognized, certified teacher. Of course not. It goes beyond that. This is something that we shared with my father, my uncles. Interesting.
When would you like to see a final product done by?
Well, semester's coming to an end.
Are you here in May anyway, or should we just at the end of the semester to go? Or?
I try to shoot for the end of the semester.
Okay.
Because I don't know, how easy it's going to be to catch me after that. I'm probably a lot of different things. Have maybe a little bit on to get together with them. And I think I can keep the exchange going. And it helps that we try to stay on target. It's pretty much up to you. Whatever you can do. You're the guy doing all the work. I'm just a consultant on the project.
That's right.
I hope you find this whole effort of value to you. It's fun for me because it does you the back and forth. Things that really somebody gets put out of my mind. Not intentionally. I haven't talked about the telegram service in years. No, really. It's really an insignificant thing when you think of it in one sense. On the other hand, it really helps to emphasize the point of how a lot of things come into play as a part of an educational process. For kids. Kids would always know what the hell is going on. You take off out of the classroom, go and pick up the radio, listening to see what telegrams there are. They could hear the radio sometimes through the hallway. They had 2, 3, 4 classes in the building. And they were always interested in somebody's freight was the route, and there'd be a telegram from Seattle, or somebody was supposed to pick up meet an airplane at such and such a time.
Well, I'm glad that you think it's worth your time.
Yeah, it's
for me. It's really just focusing really on that.
You still have to get out there in rural Alaska and do your teaching.
Yep.
You got to do that these days. You enjoy it. You'll go out with an appreciation, I think. A lot of what's happened in a good understanding of the research.
Special sensitivity, and with that sensitivity, some direction to create some things.
Yeah. As long as you're sensitive to what's going on, sensitive to people, you'll be able to have an impact. It's small. It grows, the more experience you get, the more you know how to impact the situation. And help you. That's all about good teaching. Do the best you can to give people a hand. They're learning how they look at things. It's fun. I see the results when you